Hey, what's up guys, it's Nix2, and today I'll be showing you guys why I think Rogue is currently the best class in the Diablo 4 beta. This is a bit of a controversial take at the moment because everyone seems to have the impression that Sorc and Necro are much better, and while Sorc and Necro are very strong, I think most people that think that they are stronger than Rogue by a large margin simply just haven't used the right build on Rogue, which, as I'm sure you can tell by the gameplay, does absolutely insane damage. The build does so much damage in fact that with a very unoptimized setup and not min-max gear really at all, I was able to kill the world boss 6 times back to back by just swapping layers over and over again, which I posted a video on yesterday if you're interested in checking that out. Not only does Rogue have by far the highest boss DPS in the game at the moment, it also has the best mobility out of all of the classes, allowing you to just zip through the map, which is a ton of fun, but it also has extremely strong AoE capability, enabling you to clear dungeons very quickly, and honestly just making it a super effective build overall. You can also build into a ton of survivability if you're having issues with that. Honestly though, the best part about this build is you only need one legendary for it to become very strong, and you happen to get this legendary as an aspect through completing part of the campaign in Act 2, so when the game does actually come out, you can pretty much have this build set up in just a couple hours of playtime and just completely blast through the leveling process, which is exactly what I plan to do. Before the game comes out, I'll upload a very in-depth leveling build guide, and I plan to do that for pretty much all the characters, so if you're interested in that, make sure to subscribe, like the video if you end up enjoying it, and stick around till the end to see a full dungeon run. But without further ado, let's just get into the build. I'll get into the entirety of the skill tree in a second here, but first I want to explain what the core of the build is, which is pretty much twisting blades. By default, what this does is it's going to impale an enemy, dealing a decent amount of damage. While they're impaled, they take extra damage, but it's also going to have this sort of boomerang effect where once you impale them 1.5 seconds afterward, the blade is actually going to return to you, and while it is returning to you, it also does additional damage. So it creates kind of this boomerang effect where I hit this guy and then the blade is going to follow me after the 1.5 seconds and hit anything in its path. By default, this is particularly strong. Where this gets very good is when you pair it with the legendary, which I'll talk about more in a second here, which essentially makes this return effect have an additional orbiting effect. So as you can see, when it returns, it now orbits around me for a second. On paper, this is not particularly insane. The reason that this is very good is because not only is it going to do a portion of that damage from the return hit, but it's also going to, let me get away from this guy because it's loud, but it also is going to effectively double dip into the Twisting Blades cooldown reduction that we get here through the Advanced Twisting Blades node immediately after the second one, which basically anytime that the Twisting Blades returns, like boomerang passes through enemies, it's going to give us cooldown reduction. But the orbit actually counts for this as well, so we get a crazy amount of cooldown reduction just by using these two things together. This is why on bosses, etc., you see that I'm just getting my cooldowns back ridiculously quickly, making it to where I have nearly 100% uptime on all of my imbuement skills, as well as Dark Shroud for survivability, and my Shadow Clones for an additional 60% damage. This is pretty much the only thing that you need for the build to work. Obviously, there's more legendaries that synergize very nicely with it, but honestly, you don't really need anything other than this legendary, because not only is it going to, give you additional damage for Twisting Blades, but it's also going to make you tap into that cooldown reduction again. It also just does a whole bunch of separate damage instances, which is good for a myriad of reasons. I'll show the rest of my gear later for those of you that are interested, and you're interested in min-maxing legendary powers, etc., and I'll talk about some good options there. But first off, we'll talk about the rest of the build. So obviously, if our goal is to be able to spam Twisting Blades, and that's going to do the majority of our damage, that is going to cost resource. So the way that we have pretty much infinite resource is going to be through Inner Sight, where anytime we attack marked enemies, it's going to fill up our Inner Sight gauge, and then when the gauge is full, we get unlimited energy. And when you're fighting a single target, that's the only enemy that you're fighting, and you're going to be proccing this very quickly as well, pretty much infinitely, because Twisting Blades is going to do so many separate instances of damage. It's going to count as attacking that enemy, so you're going to fill up the Inner Sight gauge infinitely. So having energy literally is a non-issue, but also we can solve some of our energy issues when it comes to ad clearing with our talent tree. So let's just go into everything that you want to use. When it comes to the basic skill, it honestly doesn't matter. If you're leveling and stuff, I think Blade Shift is good for movement speed, Invigorating Strike is very good for energy regen, and Puncture is good for applying vulnerable, but you end up getting to a point where the build is so fleshed out that the only thing that you're doing is right-clicking, and left-clicking is just a waste of your time, even if you're trying to apply vulnerable. So ultimately, use whatever you want. If I really wanted a left click, I would probably use Puncture for the vulnerable. I just have 2 points into Invigorating Strike, just in case I'm ever like super out of energy. I can just plop that in there. Obviously, you want to max out Twisting Blades so that it does more damage, and then you get the Enhanced Twisting Blade, so it does 30% increased damage when returning, very good. of course, the cooldown reduction there. I ignored all of this, but if you want some survivability, spending 1 point into Sturdy and then dropping 3 points into Siphoning Strikes makes you pretty much invincible as long as you have a decent amount of crit. But because the Twisting Blades Orbiting does so many separate instances of damage, you crit a lot with it. Pair this with our Shadow Imbuement, which also does a whole bunch of instances of damage. You're going to be healing pretty much full health anytime that you attack enemies. Regardless though, getting into our movement, Shadow Step is a skill that you want to never take off. Not only does this do very good damage, it also makes you unstoppable, it passes through enemies, it has a 100% lucky hit chance, which interacts with a lot of things as well, but it's also just insane for movement. You can also get a legendary that gives you 2 charges of this, very good. But also, if there wasn't enough reasons to think Shadow Step was one of the better skills in the game, it gives you 50% movement speed, and it's going to give you 8% crit against the enemy that you 8% crit chance against the enemy that you Shadow Step towards, and it's also going to stun them. And stunning enemies has a whole bunch of interactions. Particularly, you can get damage against stunned enemies, and there's also a legendary that gives you 50% damage against stunned enemies. So, yeah, Shadow Step not only is your get out of jail free card, it does damage, it's your movement, it stuns guys, it's crazy. I have +1 skill to agility here, so I'm able to get dash for free. Otherwise, I would just put the 1 point into dash. This is purely for movement. Later in the game, when you're doing very, very high-end content, you may end up swapping dash out for a different skill because it's purely used for movement. Although, once you get more skill points, getting additional crit damage against enemies damage by dash is pretty good, and then you can also make it slow enemies so that you can take advantage of some slow multipliers, but for now we don't have enough skill points to do that. For the rest of the tree, I dropped 3 points into Exploit to just do a whole bunch of extra damage. This maths out to about 3% per point, so about 9% overall, so that's pretty good. And then I have 1 point into Malice because we are applying Vulnerable through Shadow Imbuement. Shadow Imbuement is how we're going to be doing any amount of AoE damage. Pretty much just imbues our abilities, and it's going to make it to where anytime we kill an enemy while they are affected by this, they're going to have an explosion. I could talk about Shadow Imbuement forever, but basically you put it on and boom boom. Enhanced Shadow Imbuement, very good, so that any enemy that is injured while they are affected, have a 25% increased chance to crit them, very good. And then you also get Vulnerable, which is very good because you're going to be pretty much proccing these explosions all the time. Later on, I believe in Act 3, we get access to this legendary, which is basically going to make the vulnerability application happen all the time, because anytime we just cast the imbuement skill, it's going to trigger that explosion. So make sure to be on the lookout for that once the actual game comes out. But when you pair this with Shadow Crash, this doesn't really matter, but consuming shadows to get 30 energy each time you kill an enemy with shadow damage, which we're constantly doing with the Shadow Imbuement, you get a crazy amount of energy regen, which is very, very nice. Then for the rest of our points, I just went into Shadow Clone. This is just an ultimate skill. It just makes you do 60% extra damage when it's up, pretty much. And then I dropped 2 points into Innervation to just gain a whole bunch of extra energy. And again, because our Twisting Blades Orbit is hitting so many separate damage instances, we're benefiting from this a whole bunch, getting a lot of additional energy. One thing I want to touch on is Shadow Clone versus Dark Shroud. Shadow Clone is incredibly good for just absolutely nuking bosses, but if I were to level and I was just generally doing dungeons, I would probably keep on Dark Shroud most of the time. Not only because you have really high uptime on this, because we're going to be reducing the cooldown a lot, giving yourself pretty close to 50% damage reduction when you have 5 orbs up, which is incredibly powerful. But also, you can get countering Dark Shroud, which gives you 10% crit chance while you at least have 2 of the shadows active, which you have up pretty much all the time. So you can essentially view this as 10% crit chance all the time, while gaining a whole bunch of damage reduction. So if you're having any sort of survivability issues, you just take off Clone and go Dark Shroud. I could easily see a world in Endgame where you just take off Dash, you keep Shadow Step on, and you have really low cooldown on that, so that's your main mobility, and you play with Clone for bosses, and just overall doing more damage. Then you play with Dark Shroud as well for that damage reduction. If you wanted to melt bosses even more, you could take the points out of Innervation and get the Super Shadow Clone, just do 20% extra damage. There's a whole bunch of other places that are good to spend your points on, but after a lot of testing, this is what I prefer for the current version of the game. If you're interested in where I would spend the points past level 25 for leveling, etc., just make sure to subscribe and I'll have a fully in-depth leveling build out eventually. When it comes to stats on gear, I'd recommend aiming to try to get damage to close range enemies on pretty much as many pieces as humanly possible. Next to that would probably be core skill damage. After that, I don't know, some variation of crit chance, etc. Not a huge deal because it's hard to optimize your gear on the beta. Other legendary effects that are very good for this are This one, where skills deal increased damage based on your available primary resource. We're going to have infinite energy a lot of the time with this build, pretty much taking full advantage out of this whenever we have Inner Sight up, so this is particularly strong. I have deal damage when I have a barrier. Pair this with the barrier elite, that's pretty good. Twisting Blades Orbit, of course. And then I have critical strikes with our core skills, meaning our Twisting Blades increases our attacking speed so we can just spam it out even more. And then I also have increased critical hit chance against injured enemies, not all that big of a deal. The Shadow Step one, giving us 2 charges of Shadow Step and refunding it if we happen to kill an enemy with a Shadow Step. Very, very good. The extra damage against stun enemies I mentioned before. This one I think is particularly cool. Anytime we dash, it drops a smoke grenade. Smoke grenade will daze enemies, so it's pretty good for just overall gameplay, and it counts as utility, but you can actually take advantage of this through damage multipliers, etc. So that's pretty good. And on the helmet, I just have 50% increase against unstoppable enemies, but you can actually get a helmet that gives you, I think I deleted it on accident. You can get a helmet that gives you movement speed anytime that you drop a smoke grenade, so that would pair nicely with the chest piece. Another thing that you can get is gain a free Dark Shroud Shadow every 3 seconds when standing still, but it's going to increase the damage reduction that you get from Dark Shroud by 2% per shadow. So overall, if you have 5 shadows, that's another 10%, but this goes up to 4%. So if you had a max roll, you'd be getting 20% extra damage reduction at 5 shadow stacks. So that's really, really, really good for survivability. Here I'll just show some dungeon gameplay. Like I was mentioning earlier, I do think that Dark Shroud is probably better for like general dungeon gameplay or like leveling, but not a big deal. I mean, the Shadow Clone is really, really good for just nuking elites. This is probably my favorite dungeon, Anika's Cabin, because you just get a whole bunch of legendaries, and I farmed it a bunch. The only like downside, I guess if you want to call it that, with this build is that the damage is a little bit delayed. So obviously, you know, I can just run through these guys, just completely decimate them, but the damage sometimes takes a little bit because I have to wait for the return to actually start happening. So the damage is delayed by about 1.5 seconds, and sometimes you'll have to backtrack, because ideally, like, the fastest way to play this build is you just hit a guy and you walk away, hit a guy and you walk away, but the enemies aren't always stacked up for you to be able to perfectly do that. But if you don't have to kill every enemy, then it's a good way to play, and it's just like really, really quick. In terms of what buttons you want to be pressing, I mean, you Shadow Imbue on cooldown, and then right after you Shadow Imbue, right click a guy, and then you just TP away from him with either dash or Shadow Step. Shadow Step, if it's available, is probably the best thing to do, because it's going to apply that stun, and it's also going to give you the crit against whatever enemy you Shadow Step towards. But if you have stuff built... Did I get enough? I didn't collect any of it. Dude, the objectives were so annoying. What was I saying? Dash could be better if you're playing like the dash slows stuff, as well as... I was trying to do it quickly, but now I'm just wasting time. The dash slows, and also dash drops the smoke bomb. Could be better to dash instead. But yeah, oh, I like lagged out there. Who's this guy? Yeah, the movement is really, really fluid. I think that there's more legendaries that'll make the movement even better. Like, I don't even have any movement speed right now. You can get a whole bunch of movement speed with the build. There's even a thing where whenever you crit an enemy, you get movement speed. That's an extra like 15% in total. But yeah, just keep in mind that if your survivability is bad, definitely take off clones and definitely put on Dark Shroud. And if you feel like you don't have any healing, the only thing that you need to get more healing is the one tree that I mentioned earlier in the video. Make sure to watch the whole skill tree portion if you missed that. But healing on crits, and then, you know, the Shadow Imbuement gaining extra crit chance, while also the Shadow Clone, not the Shadow Clone, no, what am I talking about? The orbiting thing does so many separate damage instances that you'll just be proccing that a lot. Yeah, I feel like the gameplay is almost kind of boring to watch, because it's like, yeah, you know, I'm just walking through, blowing everything up. I have to pick up this garbage. I really wish they would kind of, I don't know, redesign the dungeon so I didn't have to pick up a bunch of garbage, but whatever. Do I only have to get one? Oh, I only have to get one. Okay, speedrun. Speedrun, world's fastest dungeon run, confirmed. Is there a boss here? I don't remember if this is a boss. If this is a boss, world's fastest dungeon run. No, it's not a boss. Unlucky. The build does feel kind of annoying sometimes when you have a situation like this. Like, you can actually run out of energy if you can't get your inner sight procced, and there's not like a whole bunch of guys. But it's just because they're, you know, spawning and trickling in. One side issue is that when you're super geared and you kill everything instantly, you can't fully take advantage of the cooldown reduction. because everything just dies so quickly that you don't... Oh, there's no boss? What the heck? All right, well, I'll roll some boss footage because I imagine a lot of people skip to the end and they want to see a boss. I thought there was a boss here. But like I was saying, sometimes on like little enemies, it's hard to get the cooldown reduction if you're just instantly killing them because the Twisting Blade isn't orbiting a lot. But I mean, who really cares? You know, you get more than enough cooldown reduction as it is. And if you're one-shotting, that's a good problem to have, right? Anyways, that's pretty much it. If you enjoyed, please sure to drop a like, subscribe for videos similar to this one. And thank you guys so much for watching. Have a good one, and peace.